Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Clapp Memorial Library. My name is Michael Carolan, and
I kicked the power cord, I guess.
So I can tell you a little bit about myself and how I got interested in this community called Dwight, which is in North Belchertown. It's been 20 years since I moved here. I moved up from the Washington, D.C. area, where I was a government writer and reporter, and I wanted to go back to school. I got into UMass, and so then the kids were little. I brought my wife and kids, and I started looking around the place. We bought the place. We started renting first, and then we bought the place. And I realized before I got here that I didn't really like the name Belchertown. I lived in Alexandria, which is this beautiful, evocative word, of course. And I was moving to Belchertown. And so with that, I looked on some maps before I actually got here, and I found out that indeed on the map there was a place called Dwight. It had still made it on a lot of maps actually still on today, and the atlases you can find it. And so there began my sort of odyssey over the last 20 years of thinking about researching with the help of course, the Belchertown Historical Association and the Jones Library, and Ancestry.com, a lot of different sources. I started piecing together the story of this little, I like the idea of doing a little 8 square mile area around where the focus of my house was, and doing a sort of deep dive into the history of the place. So that's sort of, and I'm a creative writer, so I like stories, so that's sort of how it all started. And so I wanted to thank some people before I get going, and certainly Clapp Memorial Library, the Belchertown Historical Association, the Jones Library, the archivist there, Cliff McCarthy, who couldn't be here tonight, Liz Poles, who's been a great resource and who hopefully you'll hear a little bit from tonight. And also Jerry, I don't see Jerry, maybe he didn't make it. There's a guy named Jerry Bannister, who, that's all you need is, you need a guy, to meet a guy who grew up in your neighborhood and who has all this knowledge, as well as the knowledge that there's this treasure trove of letters that basically were written by a member of the community and document really wonderfully the years, really the late 1700s all the way up into the late 1800s. He wrote a treasure trove of letters and gossip, really, about all the residents and the ongoings of this small community before he left. Well, actually, he wrote them when he was in New York. He had left, but we'll get to that later. So let's start. I can start by telling you, I love the fact that there were 22 freight and passenger trains that came through 2 railroad lines in our little section north of town, or at least that's what some history books are telling us. And then also the place featured at one time or another, and I'll go through this litany, 4 sawmills. I think it really is like 6 or 7 sawmills, a grist mill, and we're talking about an 8 square mile area, mountainous, or hilly, I should say, with 3 main streams. There was a grist mill, a cider mill, a tannery, a silk mill, a powder mill, a carding mill, a wood turning shop, a carpenter shop, a blacksmith, a wheelwright, a wagon maker, a gunsmith, a school, a church, a grocery store, a restaurant, a tavern, an overnight inn, dance halls, and a post office. So what else do you need for a sort of thriving place? And you can see how we've been named all these different sections. I sort of got the boundary here below Lake Arcadia, above Metacomet, all the way over to the Granby line. And then you can see where we get all these great names and we finally settled with North Belchertown, right? It's sort of the sort of simple way that people refer to us. Okay, and this I showed this last time. It's a slide that shows all the schools that were in this 8 square mile area. Really beginning in 1785 up on the Gulf Road, 1807 to 1823 up across from Blubby, what we know as Blubby's. If you know Route 9, there's this big old, looks like a log cabin called Blubby's. This was across from there for a few years. It got dilapidated but stayed standing for quite some time. They held services in this schoolhouse later in the history, but they ended because you couldn't teach in there evidently. And then they built this other one right here, 1823 to 1833 roughly, and it was down in what was called the Grove across from the Dwight Chapel. Now, it was at this schoolhouse I want to keep you focused because this is really where some activity happened. And that's our big claim to fame up in the north part of town. We have Henry Ward Beecher, who, I love this quote here, is basically the 19th century's prototype for big church, bright light evangelical Christianity. A lot of you may have heard of him. He was an abolitionist. He's the younger brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who of course writes Uncle Tom's Cabin, emphasized God's love, and of course, in classic style, a scandalous adultery trial which did not faze his congregation or his fame and popularity. You might want to know that, yes. And then we go on from there, and the claim to fame was he gave his first talk at Dwight in 1831. He was a student at Amherst College, first year student. This is kind of an early picture of him. I don't know if it's that exact year, but he is said to have walked down one dark night with a guy by the name of Harrington, and came to the schoolhouse down here. I'm going to jump ahead to this man who really gives us insight into what happened that night because he writes about it later. This is Josiah Edward Dwight. He is of the Dwight family that owned the depot and ran the sort of neighborhood and were very instrumental in Belchertown founding and community. And he was born, of course, after Beecher spoke. His father had heard Beecher and had hoped his son would become a minister. You'll notice his name is Edward. I think it might be Edwards. Edwards, yeah, which comes from the Jonathan Edwards. And I guess his first cousin, 2 generations back, had married a Mary Edwards, so he got that name. And he probably disappointed his dad because he did go into the harness and saddlery business instead and left Dwight. But late in life, he wrote to Beecher, still sort of obsessed about this whole thing, what happened here. And Beecher returned and replied to him this great letter that basically says, listen, I know where I spoke, and I spoke here. This is at the corner of Goodell and Federal Street. This was there. It is the Dwight homestead from about 1775. It burned in 1870, but this would have been standing there. What's there now is a blue Italianate. I'll show you that later. But this is where the good minister said he spoke way back in 1831. However, we have this lovely lady here who is the aunt of Josiah, who was actually there, was age 19 when Beecher spoke. Her name is Eliza Dwight Root. She played a big role in Belchertown as well. And she, of course, had something different to say. She remembers the occasion perfectly, and that's a quote. The two, Harrington and Beecher, did not talk in the Dwight home, but they spoke in the Little Red Schoolhouse. They had supper, however, at that beautiful home we saw there, and she recalled that young Beecher, quote, was in the best of spirits, and that he had promenaded up and down the sitting room, flourishing a hymn book in one hand and a pair of spectacles in the other, in imitation of the Reverend Dr. Somebody, who was a well-known eminent divine of that day, much to the entertainment of the company. So those were her memories. we have to trust that it was in the red schoolhouse. That's when her sister, Delia, who was age 8, comes into play a few years later. This would be 2 years after Beecher spoke there. We have a sad story about Delia. It was after the 1833 Christmas party. She was 10 years old. She was given a pail of ashes at the schoolhouse, the Christmas party, to take out and dump. And this she did very carefully in the woodshed and spat upon the spark to put it out. But of course, when she awoke, quote, the next morning, it was to hear how all the men in the neighborhood had fought in vain to save the burning school. So the actual school was destroyed, and this is actually where the schoolhouse stood. I love how history sort of repeats itself. This is a nice house that came in 1900 or so. It might have been moved there, but it is painted red and is in the exact spot of the old schoolhouse that burned. The schools then, they got smart. They stopped building in wood. This is the 4th schoolhouse. It is made of brick, and you can see it lasted a long time. However, a fire did sweep through in 1907 and destroy it. Then this is the final schoolhouse. You can still see it. It is part of a house across from the Dwight Chapel. It's on the front end of the house when you're driving down Federal. There's a big house behind it now. However, this is a very old shot, probably from 1914 or so, of the pupils there at they called it Union Schoolhouse at that point. It was in the Union School District. And I want to focus in on this young man here, Orrin Bracey Sr., born in 1904. His father was born in Jamaica. His dad bought land on the Great Hill, basically, for those that know that neighborhood, at Munsell and Gold Street, I think it is. Yes, Munsell and Gold, way up on the Great Hill. And Orrin then, he became, his dad bought the land and he went to Belchertown School. He became the 1921 valedictorian of Belchertown High at the age of 15. Here he is in his high school graduation picture. This is his brother, Pernette. And so what happened was his dad did not want him to send him down to Howard, which was the only black college at the time. So he applied to UMass, and you guessed it, he did not get in. We know why. And so he spent the rest of his life, oh, there I go again. This is Orrin Bracey Jr. This is Orrin Bracey Sr. We had a lovely time with he and Mary Ellen. They came down to the Belchertown Historical Society. There you go, thank you. Yeah.
Trip on the chair.
They came down to the Belchertown Historical Association, the Stonehouse Museum here in town, and we had quite a long interview about their lives and his life in particular in Belchertown. So, and he had moved back. He was up in Hardwick, Vermont, but he had recently moved back onto his grandfather. His grandfather, who came from Jamaica, had built the home up there on the hill, and he's now living in the home up on the hill, returning to Belchertown. So, okay. Next, we get back to the Dwight family. So I mentioned the earlier Dwight, Josiah Edwards Dwight. This is his father, Harrison Dunbar Dwight, and his mother, Sophia Cook. She's from a Hadley family. His grandfather was Justice Dwight, who was the son of Nathaniel Dwight, who's a big name in town, colonist really. His grandfather had first moved up to our neighborhood and settled in 1769. They married, and Harrison apprenticed down in Hartford, Connecticut as a gunsmith. And so, believe it or not, the other day, I'm looking on the internet and I find one of his guns. It's a very rare find. I've searched for a gun earlier, I never found one. There's his imprint. And he made it up in the north end of town there. For about 5 to 10 years he was in business. He was good friends with Samuel Bowles of the Springfield Republican, who was a young publisher at the time. He was a bit older, Harrison, and this is in 1845. he and Samuel, who needed a break, the Republican was going from a weekly to a daily, and this 19-year-old was in charge of everything from reporting to printing to laying out those little letters in the old-time newspapers. And so they needed a break, so he went down to New Orleans to recuperate. Of course, he wrote letters that were published in the Republican, missives from the strange South, Bowles did. And Harrison, of course, sold his guns and went around getting business for his rifle factory, which the demand of his rifle, quote, of superior make, extending to the far west and south as far as New Orleans. That's from a little biography of him. This is in 1844. Bowles did recover. They all came back. Here's Sophia. She wrote Evenings with My Grandchildren, a little booklet over in the Stonehouse Museum. And they had 40 years of a happy married life. And they loved the house they lived in. And sadly, it burned down, the house. And they rebuilt in 1870, and then Harrison died about 8 years later. In 1878, Harrison died, and then the house went into other hands. But luckily, arduous researcher that I am, I found this lovely woman here. She is the great-great-great-grandchild of Harrison, and this is her family from the Boston area. They came out to Belchertown to find out what this namesake of their family was all about, this little village of Dwight. And we had a good time with them. This is the house again. To say about this, it's just another picture of the house, I guess. So this is another Dwight. This is the brother of Harrison. He is the first president of our historical association. He was a farmer. He lived really in the center of town. It was really Harrison that lived up in the northern part of town. And it probably had something to do with his grandfather, Justice, who I might mention now that we're in revolutionary 250th anniversary times. Justice was a Tory, and he also did not like what was going on in the Belchertown Congo church. And so that was one of the reasons that he left the center of town and went up and built a log cabin in 1769. And Dwight becoming really the first family up there, starting the Dwight Cemetery, which is really the only thing that has the Dwight name anymore. He started, their grandfather started it in 1785 with the death of one of their children, a 10-year-old named Sophia. So back to Harrison. Nathaniel's not really a part of this. He's a lot younger than Harrison. And Harrison then builds this train station. Because lo and behold, over in Amherst, we've got 1851, the Massachusetts General Court incorporates the Amherst and Belchertown Railroad. Edward Hitchcock, who we saw last time, remind me next time I do this to invite you to part one. Edward Hitchcock had a big role. He was part of the Board of Trustees, geologist, Amherst College president. Then we had Edward Dickinson, Emily Dickinson's father, lawyer in town, really wanted the railroad. And we also had a judge and a state house representative by the name of Ithamar Conkey of Pelham fame, and the merchant Luke Sweetster, who we know from Sweetster Park in Amherst. And they were on the board, and finally, after a couple of failed attempts, February 6th of 1852, Edward Dickinson writes to his son, Austin, "You will see by the editor's glorification in today's Express newspaper that the Amherst and Belchertown Railroad is a fixed fact. The contract is made. The working men will be digging in Logtown next week, and we shall soon see those animating shanties smoking through an old flour barrel for a chimney before many days. The boys fired a few guns, old folks looked on approvingly, and the whole thing seems so much like a dream. The two great eras of history of Amherst are the founding of the college, #1, and the building of the railroad, #2. And down at Dwight, actually, not far from this very spot, which is at Federal and Goodell Streets. If you go by, I'll show you a little picture of it later. There was a 20-gun salute, a brass band removal of the earth, hundreds showed up, and Edward Hitchcock, our friend here, this is a later picture of him, shows up and decides that the place should not be called Logtown anymore, but instead he wants to rename it Hopetown. Announces to everybody. Of course, everybody claps because who wouldn't want to change their name from Logtown to Hopetown? And we'll hear a little bit more about that later. On May 3rd of 1853, the first locomotive goes from Palmer to Amherst. They're connecting to New London, the port down there, of course. There's a march. Edward's at the head of the march. Emily, of course, is nowhere to be found. She's off in the woods, no doubt, getting ready to write a few years later what's called I Like to See It Lap the Miles, her famous poem about the railroad. If you haven't read it, look it up. It's a great poem. There was Irish shanties all along the road because the Irish were building the railroad. The Belchertown stops included Dwight and then another little flag stop down by the ponds called Federal Street stop, and then Belchertown at a railroad station, and then Barrett's Junction in the south. So that's just another view, and that's what it looks like today. The train station would actually be right about here. And I went out there and took a picture of this when we had a snowstorm. And sure enough, the New England Central still rattles through there. This is to give you a look at everything happening in Dwight. You know, you had running mills at the Red Stars. You had old mills at that point not really running anymore. You had 3 schools, one down here sort of out on 202, and one in the middle. This was the brick one we saw earlier, and then you had one up here, the Great School. And these are some of the names. There's a cemetery here. There's a cemetery here, which is the Dwight Cemetery. That's the chapel. And those are some of the names of the people in town. And then we get to the Goodells. This is the reason we know so much about Dwight. Ira Chafee Goodell lived from 1800 to 1877. He was really started off as a young man making fashionable horse buggies. He had a business deal go bad. He moved to New York. Before that, he went out, I think, to Hardwick or somewhere over Enfield. Thank you. I'm looking at Liz. He went to Enfield and he apprenticed with a painter and he became a portrait artist. They call him itinerant portrait artist because I guess they traveled or something, but he lived in Soho, I think was it Greenwich Village, before it was fashionable in the 1830s. He was down there and all the way to the end of his life. And he wrote copious letters back to his nephew, and that's why we know about him. These letters are at the Jones Library. This is one of his lovely pieces he did. I think, is this paint?
It's a watercolor.
Watercolor. This is a lovely world map. I don't see Dwight on there. So this is his brother, Azahel. It's his younger brother. Azahel stays on the farm at, I'll call it Blubby's, but stays at the Goodell homestead. The grandfather arrived in about 1777. So a little after the Dwight family, the Goodell family came, his grandfather. But this is Azahel and Cynthia Newell, and they will have, I think, 8 children there on the farm. You'll see this is Blubby's, this is the home. It was built in 1833, believe it or not, and it still stands. And this is what it looked like. This is around 1880. These are some of the Goodells out in front of the place. And this is back to Azahel. This is a sort of memorial piece they wrote toward the end of his life in picturesque Hampshire. Big, beautiful old book. And he's the father of Wesley, who we'll find later, takes over the railroad after Harrison Dwight dies, and Lafayette, who is Lafayette, who we'll know soon of Pansy Park fame. This guy was a prognosticator. He predicted every U.S. president for 50 years, 58 years, but 2. He was an abolitionist and among only 3 Belchertonians to vote for the anti-slavery candidate in 1842. He wrote a lot, and he wrote for the Amherst. What did he write for? He wrote for the old newspapers. the Hampshire Gazette, which still is around, the Northampton Free Press, and the Amherst Record. And his son Wesley up here, who we'll meet later, also wrote for newspapers, including the Springfield Republican. So in 1868, so this is, a good nearly 20 years after Hitchcock names the place, he writes this editorial, April 2nd, published, AG, which is Asahel Goodell on Logtown, and its notables. And he's really going on in a very long piece about this area and how illustrious it was. We cannot boast of large manufactories, stores, or churches. We have our full share of useful and eminent men, embracing clergymen, physicians, teachers, artists, civil engineers, some of whom count their property by the hundreds of thousands. And I mean, he was really wanting the place to rename itself to Hopetown. And he said it would not be improbable, quote, that Hopetown will be incorporated in course of time, quote, adopted by the people generally. And ironically, the place around this time was known for its poverty, actually, and I think that's probably why he wrote it. The farm at that point was run down. His son Lafayette was getting ready to, or opening, the seed business that would bring prosperity to our neighborhood with Pansy Park. So here we have Lafayette. He's 17. He invests $25 in a seed business on his father's rundown farm. He hires his older brother, who becomes the station agent, Wesley. They build ponds and greenhouses all over this place, some of which you can sort of see the remnants of, or where they would be. There's a parking lot there now. And they pretty soon had 50,000 customers, if you can imagine. They really got up and going with these seed catalogs. Every year they would put them out. And then the coming of the railroad right before 1889, 1885, with its own stop on the Boston and Maine Railroad. Hundreds came to tour his renowned aquatic and flower gardens known as Pansy Park, deemed a popular destination in the 1890 guide, Carriage Driving in Western Massachusetts. There were asters and pinks and petunias and cherries and plums and peaches and a gazillion more. And of course, there was the pansy. He's mustachioed and dapper, as you can see there. He had no formal degree, yet Harvard collected his specimens. There was an effort recently to go find them. They're evidently over in UMass somewhere. And he's an intrepid experimenter with crossbreeding. We had another guy in town named Howard, who some of you know did the same thing and made famous with the strawberry a little farther south than Dwight. But this guy did not concern himself so much with profit, and I suppose it showed. He had orders as far away from Japan, New Zealand, and it was said that Emily Dickinson, the gardener, also came out to visit, although I haven't found that to be a fact. This is a lovely picture blown up to big size of what it looked like. So basically there's a Shumway, used to be over here with wood chips, like a wood chip place right where we're standing from this angle. And I think that's one of the grandkids of Asahel. Lindsay, yes. So there we have it from that angle. This is another famous daughter of Asahel. This is Ellen Goodell Smith. She wrote a book on vegetarianism, believe it or not. This illuminating title. It's really encouraging to have Fat of the Land on how to live on it. Chapters on nuts and vegetable oils, very forward-thinking. Not many women were doing that at this time. This is just a really beautiful color photograph of Lafayette, his nephew, Lindsay, and his sister, the good doctor. And then we have back to our friend Ira, who had several children, had quite a few children. 6 children, all of whom predeceased him, except for one, I think. One survived, he and his wife. He married a woman in New York City. This was in the time of consumption. And this is his son. This was a son that lived until the age of 28, but it was his bright and shining young genius, learned stenography at 6, soon became an expert and gave public performances, completed whole Bible in less than 5 days' time, or at the rate of 120 words per minute. His father was really into cataloging how quick he was and what a genius he was, and here we have some of the shorthand in the Bible written there. And his name is Angelo Newton Franklin Goodell. And he actually named a lot of his children Newton, after Newton and Franklin, I think, weren't there?
He was the third Angelo, I think.
He's the third Angelo, yeah.
Most
He
of them
kept
died
very young, yeah.
2 years old.
Uh-huh. And there he is in a famous painting that he did of his son. And I think this is in a private collection now. It was found by Wesley after 50 years being in the attic or something. And Ira wanted it to go, the Bible is over at Amherst College finally. So it did go to Amherst College. It's over there, you can go and ask for it. And yet another interesting Goodell. This is Celeste Martineau Goodell, otherwise known as Leslie. She was into free love and married and quickly somehow got separated in the 1870s. And she also was a spiritualist and hooked up, I believe this is with her husband maybe, Steinmetz. Didn't she do this with Steinmetz?
She did with her brother-in-law,
Her brother-in-law.
John Brown Smith.
John Brown Smith. Okay, John Brown Smith, right. John Brown Smith and her did this. Maybe this came after she was married. Anyway, very non-traditional for a New England community. I would say they put out only a few issues. I found this at Smith Library. They had it, and they pulled it out, and they sent me a copy of it. I have not read the whole thing yet. At any rate, I thought I would show that. And then that segues into religion, which is, this sort of gives, we were isolated up here in Dwight. We're 5 miles from Belchertown Common. We're closer to Amherst and Pelham than we are to Belchertown. Finally, the South Amherst erected their church, so that alleviated. There was always meetings in the schoolhouse across from the Goodell home. That one I've said was dilapidated, and then the brick one, there was meetings there. 1840s, they put a Methodist church in South Amherst. Finally, there was an editorial written about religion in Dwight, and they said, never seen a place so thoroughly and happily changed. I think they were getting people to go to Sunday school finally. The Union Church Society of North Belchertown formed in the 1870s, and they had these Grove dinners. And this brings us to this woman. This is Susan Huntington Gilbert Dickinson, who used to come over and was said to have come over and with her brother, and they were fishing in Scarborough Brook, evidently. And they met a couple of boys with 2 better trout than she and her brother had. And she asked the boys, where do you boys attend school? And they said, well, the red brick schoolhouse over there, the one that we showed you. And then she said, well, where do you boys attend Sunday school? And they said, well, they didn't have to go to Sunday school. Well, she changed that. 7 pupils grew to 20. She started holding Sunday school in the town. It was very poor at that point. There was poverty. She started coming over and bringing food and clothing, and pretty much her efforts, the community got together and came up with this Union Church Society. The land was donated. There was this effort to make it a non-sectarian church. October 1886, they got it built, and in March 12th of 1887, they opened it and dedicated it, and they named it for, of course, the local family, the Dwights, who at that point had pretty much gone because Harrison had died at that point, but in honor of Harrison running the railroad, being the first railroad guy there, they named it for him. It's the Queen Anne style church. I think it should be on the National Register myself. This is the organ. I believe it's in the back of the old chapel still, and I think this is the very same organ that they took up the penny collection to buy the organ. Next we have just a little advertisement, a lovely old advertisement of 1894, the Dwight Society, the sort of community level effort that was there. That's an older picture. You can see Mount Norwatic in the background there. It's lovely. That's one I took I guess last year of the moon, and it's well illuminated still. It's still in very good shape. This was fantastic in the let's see, this was the Chapel Reed organ. I'm going to jump on to Amherst College students running the railroad down. I forgot to mention that it was a place where Amherst College students could really, get their chops going with preaching. They would ride the handcar down from Amherst College along the railroad tracks to give talks at the chapel. They also dedicated Bell, Amherst College students, the Packardsville Church, Bell, came to the Dwight church. And then this is, jump ahead quite a few years. This is August 7th of 1960, and they're doing a remodel. And they know there's a copper box in the cornerstone. And so they're prying it open here, this treasure box that was planted in 1886. And in it they found a dime. Here we go. Here's the litany of what they found. Really worked, newspapers, a potholder with Ebenezer, and this verse, Samuel 1, Samuel 7, 12, and they returned it for a bank vault for safekeeping. I haven't looked for it. I wonder where it might be, if it still exists. This is the house that is actually still there, right next to the Dwight Chapel. This was the Harrison Dunbar Dwight house on the same land of that beautiful colonial we saw earlier. When it burned, Harrison built this, and it's still there. And this is a lovely shot in the Stonehouse Museum archives of the Boston and Maine Railroad that came through. And about the same time the Dwight Chapel was built, they built a railroad line, an east-west, from Albany out to Boston that came through. Really, it ran parallel to the Central Vermont or North Belchertown line. This is a close-up of the Italianate that's still there. Oh, there it is today. And this is the center of the village. I always talk about it. Next time you drive by, you'll remember what I told you. This is the grocery store. That is the house there. Wesley Goodell bought it in 1885. He became the longest serving railway agent for the Central Vermont Railroad. Lots of activity around then. They were doing 3 daily round trips between Boston and Northampton, 2 between Boston and the Hudson, 3 between Boston and Wayland, and 2 between Ware and Northampton. So everybody was just hopping on the train from a long time, 50 years at least. They said there were 22 freight and passenger trains each day by the year 1900 coming through here. So I'm probably running out of time, aren't I? Oh, I am. This is a railroad stop on the Pansy Park. This is a postcard donated by, I think Jerry had this, and donated it. And you can see the old locomotive there, a guy hanging out. And that's just a 3-sided stop there at Federal Street in Goodell. Right there, you can see the old hump as you drive by. This I had to throw in. This is South Amherst, where the bike trail starts. If you go across Station Road, you'll get on the the Boston and Maine rail trail. It used to be it's called the rail trail. And this is a nice station that they had there for some years. This shows you a little bit of the maps. You know, you can see the two rail lines here. Dwight Station, you know, they call it Dwight. And they also have the Pansy Park Station there. I think this, yeah. And then, what happened? Oh, I gotta point it here. No? Quickly. There. This is a great road atlas map of the place. You know, very big letters, Dwight Station, Pansy Park Station. So it was still thriving. This is one of the main mills that sits at North and kind of tucked away off Route 9 at North and Gulf. It's back in the woods. I do not know the year, but I do know the family that owned it. I did some research on the Brown family that are up on Meads Corner. Robert came in roughly 1793. Settled way up there on the hill. The house still stands, beautiful house. Orrin Bracey told me there was a ballroom in there, and his uncle used to play jazz in there in the 20s. At any rate, this is down the hill from that big, it's almost to Pelham, that big house. And I forget the name of the guy that has it. No, but he's taking very good care of it. And when you drive by at Halloween, he'll put out skeletons on wagons and stuff. It's great. At any rate, this is down, I didn't have a picture of that. This is down the street from him, and this was eventually owned by his final son. He had like 12 kids, and this last son he had when he was 74 years old. And that son was named Martin Van Buren Brown. If you want to be something in life, if you want your kids to be something in life, name them for presidents. This is the, I found this evidence that this is a 20-inch wheel, water wheel that went in because Martin Van Buren Brown is listed in the catalog for the Leffel turbine, what's it called, the water turbine. 20-inch, cost $330. I didn't find out how much it is today. And there he is, in all of his glory, looking dapper. He was the youngest. He married a Wilson, who's another local family in the Dwight neighborhood. And then he went off to war, and the Wilson died. And while he was off to war in the Civil War, he had another guy come and run the mill. But he too had 12 children. And he then what happened to him? He got sick and was actually we find reference to him in the Goodell letters about him moving to Florida, and he died at age 57 after 12 kids. I can't believe it. He died of rheumatism from the war, I forget where he's buried, but I know his dad is up there on the hill on the property with his two wives. Robert and his two wives are in a little private cemetery up there on the Great Hill. This is the guy that took over. You can see him on the map. This is the sawmill, SM. This is Goodell, this is Gulf and North. And family of choppers and sawyers of Granby, yes, the Prestons. They moved to Dwight in about 1850, and he managed the mill for Martin through the war. And the interesting thing about this guy is he made the papers after his death. Some journalist, years later, found in 1906, and the guy died 20 years before that, but found out that he was buried in Granby. And it's like, talk about sensationalism. New England economy displayed on a tombstone. It is in the cemetery of Granby, Mass. The owner had to use both sides to record the names of all of his dead wives. There were 6 of them. And indeed, there were. Look at this. So this is later on in the article. They actually had an illustrator go in and do the tombstone, and he actually went to the cemetery and illustrated all those wives. And I thought, I gotta find out what happened to those wives. Where are their death certificates? But I was unable to find out what happened to them, but I did find the stone is still down there. I enhanced it a bit. It's in that little cemetery on, it's really North Granby.
West Street?
Yeah, when you go over the Harris Mountain Road, it's the road in Granby when you go up the Harris Mountain Road, and then you turn right. Is that West Street? Yeah. A big thing that happened in our neck of the woods was this balloon landed. It's the Ben Franklin, 1907, October 27th. The veteran aeronaut Professor Samuel King and 3 Philadelphians landed at Dwight after a 500-mile journey, drifting 5,000 feet above the earth. All the Amherst College kids came running down to the field in Dwight, and there was an open field on somebody named G.K. Kelly. I could not find his farm, but it made the front page of the Philly Inquirer. Balloon lands in Massachusetts. The Ben Franklin comes to Earth near Springfield, and party reports great night trip by moonlight. So this was a daring escapade. I want to turn it over and just ask Liz to say a couple words. There was a very dramatic and tragic drowning in the Holland Pond. It's the northern of our 3 ponds. They're kettle ponds left over by the glaciers that Hitchcock studied. And her name was Winzola, and she was a child of Wesley, the station agent. And so I wanted you to just tell us a little bit about what happened with her.
Okay, so Zola Mabel was 22 years old, 1906. She lived with her parents in the Italianate house that's the station master's house. She had a habit of going rowing. In those days, most of those little camps along the ponds were summer places for, mostly I think for people from Northampton. And she had friends there. She kept a set of oars at one of their houses, and she said goodbye to her mother, saying she'd be back for dinner, but she was going to collect lilies. This was July 6, 1906. And she did not come home, and her brother went looking later that evening and found the empty boat with her hair comb in it and the oars still in the oarlocks. And then for the next 3 weeks, this consumed not just locally, but it was in the news. One of the Goodell who went west with the gold rush and was living in California, his daughter, a cousin of Wesley, was on a train and saw a headline indicating that there was a girl named Goodell missing in Belchertown. So she sent the clipping. So for 3 weeks, they searched that pond, they searched the woods, mediums were hired, mediums volunteered all sorts of information that she was in Missouri and had gotten married and she'd eloped. And the parents knew that she had died, and they knew that she was someplace in the pond. They had divers, very deep pond, 70 feet at its deepest. And
Little pond.
yeah, and very cold, average temperature 40 degrees. She was seen standing up in the boat waving to a passing train on that shortly after she started rowing.
Right.
And the supposition, because they had divers, when the divers didn't find her, they dynamited the pond, sending every fish raining down on the neighborhood. And every day the father and the cousin were out looking for her. And 3 weeks after she disappeared, and it was 4 days after the last dynamiting, they felt something, nothing came up. they rowed a little further away, and there was a sheriff on the shore, and he yelled because her body had emerged. And coroner's findings were that she must have fallen over backwards in her long white dress.
Yeah.
She was still clutching the handkerchief
Wow.
in her right hand that
Wow.
supposedly was being waved at the train.
Wow.
So it was a tragedy that I think her parents never got over.
Yes.
That mother was visiting mediums 12 years after the fact who were communicating that she was greeting them with comforting words,
Right.
but this
Right, and I did see, I wanted to get a copy of that. There is a flaming headline I was reading about her, the headline was such that it was clear that she had run off at one point. I don't know if you'd seen that headline.
yeah.
It was clear that she had run off, big banner headline. She had eloped and she was alive and well somewhere. Yeah, so anyway, journalism. So thank you, thank you for that story. What happened after 07, and I guess it was 06, this happened in 07, probably cheered everybody up in the neighborhood. What happened next was a sort of slow decline. There was this 1928 sale of Pansy Park out of the Goodell family. That's that beautiful home. They turned it into a tavern. It was at one point known as the House of Ill Repute. There was alcohol served. It was also a very fun dance club where in the 20s people and the 30s people came out from Amherst to have a good time. They also built this on the lake. This is a dance hall. It featured springs on the floor. This was on Lake Arcadia, I think. There was another one on Lake Metacomet. This was the big band era, so we had music. So there was still stuff happening. Wesley, the railroad agent, then died. He lived in that blue house at the corner we've been talking about. He died in 1933. The railroad pretty much stopping and service at all in Dwight about that year. The same for the Boston and Maine Railroad stopped in 1933. Really, after that, all we have is this lovely lake, Lake Arcadia, a lovely postcard, still of its pristine beauty here. We have more probably conservation land than anywhere in Belchertown today. Trails, I think the New England National Scenic Trail crosses right through Dwight. This is a 215-mile trail. There's hikers always in our neck of the woods, the Robert Frost Trail. Of course, we've got the Neurotic Ranch Rail Trail that comes down to Warren Wright. I mean, it really is a magnificent place. In 1861, actually, in Lake Arcadia, we'll go back, Amherst College, it was proposed to introduce boating using the waters of the Belchertown Pond and procuring the use of handcars on the railroad for the conveyance of those students who should belong to the Navy. They were calling it the Navy. This was, of course, the crew team, and they came down to our pond, and on June 7th of 1870, they had this huge party with instruments and vocal music and the election of commodores and first mates and officers of this great Grand Navy. And alas, the crew team was born, which became this sort of really renowned crew team in the country, competitive UMass Sail Club, and uses it, as well as Amherst College still use Metacomet and Arcadia. And I had to use Liz's picture that she posted on Lake Arcadia, and these great, I'm a sailor myself, and these great boats on our pond. And of course we have the town beach in Dwight. Come and visit sometime. The kids loved it. My kids learned to sail at the town beach. So, and we have Dwight Day, which is June 21st of next year. We did it once already, and we're going to do it again. So with that, I am going to end and ask for some questions, if you have any. And I'm not saying I can answer them.
If you were in a hand cart and the train were coming, what did you do?
Oh. Fast.
Oh, you mean there was no way to turn it off?
I have no idea.
Oh.
I'm not the railroad expert. Yeah. I mean, maybe they would go slow through there. I don't know. Yeah. Yes. Another question.
Why did the railroad stop in 33?
Where did it stop?
No, why? Why did it stop serving?
So I think ridership went way down, and I think really the death of Wesley Goodell had a big role in the running of that little station there. I think there was passenger trains that came through, but there was no way to stop. I think they just ended the flag stop. It was considered a flag stop. I do know that the flag would be out if there were passengers, and it would stop for that. I don't know that it was on timetables. It was on earlier timetables because I did meet the historian of the Central Vermont Railroad, and it was on timetables, but earlier. In the 30s, I think the car, really. I think the car and the death of the station agent. And they used it for milk. Freight trains would come by, and I do know that farmers would still put the milk out, and they would bring it into the Amherst Creamery along the rail lines after that. So I do know they used it for that.
Where is Dwight Day held?
Dwight Day is held at the Dwight Chapel.
At the chapel.
Yeah, our very own Liz did this lovely card. We hope she can do it again. This was the one we had this year. We had this great Pelham, wonderful lady in Pelham brought her old 1920s, I forget the name of that truck, but it was great. And then this is Beecher. And we had talks and food and music. It's nice. Yeah. Yes?
You mentioned the New England Scenic Trail. I just wanted to let you know that the artist in residence this year is from Belchertown.
Ah, really? The artist in residence where?
For the New England Scenic Trail, so it's not, you don't live on the trail, but you just do art for the Connecticut.
Oh, that's awesome. And so it'll be put along the trail maybe? Or?
No, so
Oh.
basically her contract says, her contract's done, but she had an exhibit at the Holyoke Children's Museum.
Ah,
But if you're a Facebook person or the New England Scenic Trail website.
Oh, cool. Yeah, thank you for that.
What's her name?
Emma Aiken.
Yeah, all right. Yes?
There was a photograph that you had of some little sailboats on the lake. Where did you find that picture?
Oh, that one there?
That one.
That's, Liz took that. She's right over here.
Oh.
I found that on, Liz, is that Arcadia?
It is.
Yeah.
It's, I was sitting on the town beach.
She was sitting on the town beach and posted that on Facebook, and I didn't ask her permission. I hope it's
No,
okay.
that's fine. I was so charmed because
Yeah.
the UMass and Amherst College sailing clubs have been, I didn't realize, they've been practicing there for 20 years.
Oh, longer.
Or longer. And it's the most convenient place
Yeah.
to get quickly to.
And there's good wind.
There's,
Yeah.
in the, I think there was something on one of their sites that said it's a very gentle wind in the fall and very uncertain in the spring.
Yes, right.
But-
I taught my son and daughter to sail. I had a little sailboat, and we'd take it out on the lake, and we had good wind, yeah. And those are, it looks like BU, Boston University.
I think they bought used sails for
Okay.
the club.
Yeah.
Because some of them are BU and some of them are one of the prep schools.
Yeah, those are little 19-footers. I forget what they call those. They're really easy to sail.
That's really a lovely photo.
Thank you. It was such a treat to sit and watch them because you can hear them talk. and obviously a really nice coach.
Great, well, yes.
Is there any, with the lakes there and what, is there any history of cutting ice from the lakes?
You know, there is. They cut ice, I know, from Holland Pond, I believe.
The very pond that his daughter drowned in, Wesley Goodell had the ice rights. We sold them in 1920 to
The Northampton photographer who had a cottage there as well.
Okay.
So there's a deed transferring.
Oh,
Ice
ice
rights.
rights, yeah. We don't really know how much production though, necessarily, that they made out of it.
the 1854 and 1860 maps. had,
Yeah,
Ice house on it.
yeah, yeah, right. So they did use it, and there's a fellow I saw, Dennis Picard gives a great lecture on ice, the ice industry in New England. Have you heard that before? Yeah. And I do know, yes, that was used for that, yeah. Yeah, good questions. Yes?
I'm wondering if you know anything about, the corner of Channel Drive, which goes in between the two, Lake Arcadia
Right.
and Lake Holland, or Holland Pond, it's been called different things.
Right.
That's Channel Drive, right on the corner, if you're on Federal Street, and then you're gonna turn onto Channel Drive, on the right-hand corner right there, there's one old house on the corner, but that I've heard that there, and then there's another house down and stuff, but I've heard that spot might have had a small school once. Do you know anything about that, like a local school house on that spot? Do you know where I mean? Does that make sense?
I know where you mean.
I haven't heard of that.
And that also borders on on Lake Arcadia. There's a newer house that sits on that land, and then a small cottage, and then on the corner there's a Cape house, a Cape style house right on the corner. And I've heard that there was once there a small schoolhouse.
It's no longer there.
Correct,
Ah,
because the cottage
huh.
house was built, I think, in 1980, and then there's a larger house that's newer, actually.
Oh, okay.
A large kind of modern house that faces Lake Arcadia,
Okay.
and on this lot, if that makes sense to you.
It does, and
Yeah.
I will look carefully at the early maps, because when there was an official schoolhouse, it says SH
Yes. Right.
on the maps.
It does, or
And
it would?
it would.
We don't know, yeah, okay.
And it's not ringing any bells.
Yeah.
There are, in the time that this girl was missing, the Boston papers, the Worcester papers, elsewhere, they sent photographers, and there are a lot of, they're not, they're very grainy, but you can see a lot of the roof lines, and and there's references there to there having been a swimming hole down near where the channel is.
Probably
that
by the
goes from
channel
Upper
there.
Pond
Yep.
to the Middle Pond, which is what they called them back then.
Yeah, I'd love to find
Change
another schoolhouse in there, yeah. I haven't heard of that. The closest one to the Union Schoolhouse, the last one, which was 1903 to 1954, which was there across the street from the Dwight Chapel, would be the Lake Vale. They called it the Lake Vale Schoolhouse. And this was on Bay Road, just near Metacomet.
Right, sort of in the vicinity of where the cemetery is.
Yes, yeah, the Lakeville Cemetery or some other name. Yes,
Yeah, I have a question about the railroads, the two railroads.
uh-huh.
And which one was connected with the Dickinson family? Is it the father and brother of Emily?
Yeah, that would have been the Amherst Belchertown Railroad, the initial one from the really there was a long effort to get that to come to Amherst, and it finally had its maiden voyage, a run in 1853. And there was a lot of investment, a lot of money went into that from, you heard the names I listed, a lot of the merchants. And,
So is that the one that's the rail trail now, or is that?
no, it's not. It's actually, believe it or not, still operational. The New England Central, it's freight rail only. I actually took the Amtrak on that road back when the Amtrak was running that line, right by Dwight. But that hasn't been going on since 2014 or something. The Amtrak hasn't used those lines. But it is still it is still a railroad line, yeah. But the original business failed. It really went bankrupt right after it opened, the Amherst Belchertown Railway, that connected Amherst and up to, I want to say points north, I forget what, but then down to New London, connected it, but the local line went bankrupt and they ended up selling it. It finally went to the Central Vermont, so it stayed the Central Vermont Railroad for many, many years. Yeah, and now it's the New England Central. But the rail trail is the Boston and Maine. So, and they took those tracks up, I think, in the, I want to say the 80s, or anybody know?
It was the 80s.
It was the 80s. Yeah.
We were there 84.
Okay.
We used to walk
Yeah,
on the trail,
on the tracks before they took them out. Yeah. Neat.
When did you say you think they took
They took them out in the 80s, in the 1980s.
in the 80s?
Late
Yeah.
80s or early 90s.
Late 80s or early 90s, they took those up. Yeah. So anyway, great questions. Thank you all for coming out tonight, unless there's another question. Yeah.